Helen Croft was 64 years old when the world ended for the second time. She was on her knees in the garden, the way she always was on Wednesday afternoons, fingers deep in the Arizona earth, pulling weeds from around the base of her tomato plants, when the silence of her life cracked open. Not with a sound, not with a warning, just the way the first time had cracked open too. The first ending had been Rachel, her daughter, 31 years old, sitting at her kitchen table, mid-sentence, alive. And then, between one word and the next, gone. An aneurysm. No warning, no explanation, no mercy. Just the terrible, permanent theft of a living person from the world. That was 4 years ago. Helen had survived it the only way she knew how. The way she had survived everything across a lifetime that had asked more of her than most people could imagine. One foot in front of the other, never stop moving. Because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling, and feeling meant drowning in a grief that had no bottom. Rachel left behind a son. Ethan was 6 when his mother died. He was 10 now. He lived with Helen in the small adobe house on Calle Esperanza, a street whose name meant hope. And sometimes in the quiet of early morning before Ethan woke up, Helen would think about that, about building a life on a street called Hope, when hope was something she had to reconstruct from rubble every single day. Ethan was small for his age. He had his mother's brown hair and his father's serious expression and a habit of asking questions that didn't have easy answers. Why do people get sick? Why can't dogs live as long as people? Grandma, were you ever scared of anything? He wore round glasses slightly too large for his face and pushed them up his nose approximately 400 times a day. He read books 3 grade levels above his own. He was obsessed with astronomy, could name every moon of Jupiter in order, and he had a telescope in his bedroom that Helen had saved 3 months to buy, because when a 10-year-old boy looks up at the sky with wonder in his eyes, you find the money for the telescope. You always find the money. To the neighbors on Calle Esperanza, Helen Croft was simply the retired woman with the garden and the grandson. She grew tomatoes, peppers, squash, and herbs. She sold homemade salsa at the Saturday farmers market. She drove a dusty Jeep Cherokee, older than Ethan. She wore wide-brimmed hats against the punishing Arizona sun and work boots that had more miles on them than most cars. She was lean and weathered in the way of desert people, dried and toughened by heat and wind, until what remained was all bone and sinew and quiet endurance. Only one neighbor had ever glimpsed something else. Carlos Medina owned the auto repair shop at the end of the street. He'd spent 4 years in the Marines. He knew things about people that most civilians didn't know how to see. And one afternoon, a stray dog, big, part shepherd, wild with heat or fear, had lunged into Helen's front yard where Ethan was playing. Helen was kneeling in the garden 30 feet away. She covered that distance before Carlos could track the motion. One moment she was in the dirt. The next, she was between the dog and the boy, one hand gripping the animal's scruff, the other controlling its muzzle, neutralizing the threat with a calm, practiced efficiency that took exactly 3 seconds. Not frantic, not panicked, controlled, precise, inevitable. Carlos had seen people move like that, but not retired grandmothers who sold salsa at the farmer's market. "You've got fast reflexes, Helen," he said later, keeping his voice light. Helen smiled her dry, patient smile. "I've always been good with animals." Carlos didn't push it, but he noticed, the way she always knew who was behind her without turning around. The way her eyes swept a room when she entered it, quick and automatic, the way a driver checks mirrors. Not because she was thinking about it, because she couldn't stop. The phone call came at 2:15 on a Wednesday afternoon. Ethan walked home from school every day, 4 blocks. Helen had walked that route with him dozens of times, noting every house, every yard, every dog behind every fence, every intersection. She had taught him to stay on the sidewalk, to cross at the crosswalk, to look both ways, to never, under any circumstances, get into a vehicle with someone he didn't know. She had taught him these things the way all grandmothers teach these things, with love and repetition. But underneath the love, underneath the repetition, there was something else, something more systematic, something that came from a place much deeper than ordinary, grandmotherly concern. Ethan didn't come home at 3:20. He didn't come home at 3:30. Helen called his phone at 3:35. No answer. She called the school at 3:40. He had been dismissed at 3:05. She got in the Jeep and drove the route, every block, every intersection, every alley. At 3:55 she found his backpack. It was lying on its side on the sidewalk of Calle Mariposa, 2 blocks from the house. His astronomy book was on the ground beside it. His glasses were on the pavement. One lens was cracked. Helen picked up the glasses. She stood very still in the late afternoon sun, holding the broken glasses in both hands, looking at the empty sidewalk and the quiet street. The wind moved through the creosote bushes. A car passed a block away. Somewhere a dog barked. Her phone rang. Unknown number. Mrs. Croft. The voice was male, calm, American accent. But beneath it, a cadence that spoke of years spent in places where English was not the native tongue. "We have your grandson. He's unharmed. He'll stay that way as long as you follow instructions." "Who is this?" "My name doesn't matter. What matters is that you owe a debt, not financial, operational. You took something from the people I work for a long time ago, in a place very far from Tucson. They want it back. They're willing to trade the boy for it." Helen stood on that sidewalk, holding her grandson's cracked glasses, feeling the desert wind on her face and the sun on her shoulders, and deep in the bedrock of her body, something shifted. Something that had been sealed and buried and covered over with years of tomato plants and salsa recipes and Saturday morning farmers markets. Something old, something vast, something absolutely lethal. "What do they want?" she said. "A hard drive. You removed it from a compound in eastern Syria in 2014. It contains financial records, communication logs, and the identities of assets embedded in 3 governments. Your agency was supposed to destroy it. You kept a copy. My employers want that copy." Helen said nothing for 5 seconds. She breathed. The dry desert air filled her lungs, hot and familiar, the air of the place she had chosen to disappear in. "You have 6 hours, the voice continued. "I'll call back with a location for the exchange. Contact law enforcement, we'll know. Contact your former agency, we'll know. Do anything other than exactly what I tell you, and the boy disappears permanently. Do you understand?" "I understand," Helen said. Her voice was quiet, steady, the voice of someone standing on solid ground. "But I want you to understand something, too. You think you know who I am. You think you've read a file, heard a story, and you think that tells you what I'm capable of. You're wrong. The file doesn't cover it. The stories don't come close. You took my grandson, the only person left in this world that I love. You've given me 6 hours." She paused. "That's 5 hours and 50 minutes more than I need." She hung up. Helen drove home. She walked past the kitchen, where Ethan's cereal bowl from that morning still sat in the sink. She walked past his bedroom, where the telescope stood aimed at the window, where his astronomy books were stacked on the nightstand, where his bed was made, because Helen had taught him to make his bed every morning, and he did it without complaining, because he was that kind of kid. She walked past all of it, into her own bedroom, to the closet, behind the hanging clothes, behind a false panel indistinguishable from the wall unless you knew exactly where to press, a space the size of a small suitcase. Inside, a Heckler & Koch USP Tactical with a threaded barrel, a suppressor, 3 magazines, a combat knife, compact binoculars with night vision capability, a satellite phone, 2 passports under different names, $8,000 in cash, and a small black hard drive, sealed in a waterproof case the size of a deck of cards. Helen Croft had not always been Helen Croft. She was born Helen Morrow in El Paso, Texas. She grew up in the desert, the way some children grow up in music or mathematics, instinctively, completely, as if the landscape were a language, and she had been born fluent. She could navigate by stars, by sun angle, by wind direction, by the fall of shadows on sand. She could find water where every map said there was none. She could move through open terrain, vast, featureless, merciless terrain, without being seen by observers who were specifically looking for her. The desert was not her enemy. It was never her enemy. It was home. Recruited at 22 by the CIA's Special Activities Center, she completed the Ground Branch Selection Program, the one that eliminated the vast majority of candidates, and finished at the top of her class. What followed were 23 years of operations across Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, Afghanistan, Jordan, the great deserts of the world, one after another, each one a theater, and each one a sanctuary, because Helen always understood the terrain better than anyone she was up against. Her call sign was Desert Ghost. She earned it in Iraq in 2006 during an operation that became legend in the Special Operations community. Her team was compromised 60 miles inside hostile territory, communications destroyed, vehicles disabled, 3 members wounded. Helen took command. She led them out across 60 miles of open desert in 3 days, moving at night, hiding by day under improvised concealment in terrain that offered almost nothing. She found water in a dry wadi that every map marked empty. She detected and evaded 4 separate search patrols, each time before they detected her, rerouting the team through ground so inhospitable the enemy didn't bother to search it. She brought every single member of her team home alive. The forces hunting them found nothing, no tracks, no trace, no sign that anyone had ever been there at all, a ghost in the desert, seen by no one, found by no one, there and then gone. She retired at 45 when Rachel was born, chose Tucson because the desert was in her blood, and she couldn't live anywhere that didn't smell like creosote after rain. Married a quiet man named Robert Croft, who worked for the Forest Service and died of a heart attack 8 years later. Raised Rachel, built the garden, started the salsa business, became the woman on Calle Esperanza. And now someone had reached into that quiet life and taken the only thing in it that mattered. Helen assembled the pistol. Her hands moved with the fluid, automatic precision of 23 years of muscle memory. She had assembled this weapon in sandstorms, in moving vehicles, in the blackness of hide sites in the Iraqi desert, while hostile patrols passed 30 meters away. Doing it in her Tucson bedroom was, without question, the easiest thing she had done in 20 years. She picked up the satellite phone and dialed. "This is Desert Ghost." Silence. 5 seconds of it. Then a voice. Male, American, controlled in the way that voices are controlled when they belong to people who manage assets that officially don't exist. "Ghost, you've been inactive for 19 years. Someone took my grandson. They want the Kadir hard drive. The Kadir drive was supposed to be destroyed. I kept a backup, insurance, the kind you hope you never need." A beat. "Who took the boy?" American voice. Trained. Knows the 2014 Syria operation. Knows about the drive. This is someone with access to classified operational history, either former agency or someone who bought the information. Another silence. Then, "We'll run voice analysis if you can get a recording. I can have a team in Tucson in 4 hours. I don't have 4 hours. I have 6, and I'm not spending them waiting. I need a phone trace and a location. That's all." "Helen, you're 64 years old." "I have been 64 years old in this desert for every one of those years," she said. "I know this ground better than anyone alive. They brought this fight to my landscape." A pause. Quiet and absolute as the desert at midnight. "That's the last mistake they'll make." The trace came back in 40 minutes. A burner phone, but it had pinged a cell tower 16 miles southeast of Tucson, in the desert south of Vail. Satellite imagery confirmed a cluster of structures at the location, an abandoned ranch property, 3 buildings, 2 vehicles. Helen didn't wait for thermal imaging. She knew this area. She had hiked it, driven it, studied it. Across 19 years of living in Tucson, she knew every wash, every ridge, every road, every cattle trail. She knew where the ground was hard enough to drive on and where it would swallow a vehicle to its axles. She left at dusk. She drove the Jeep to a trailhead 8 miles out and covered the rest on foot, moving through the Sonoran Desert the way she had moved through the deserts of Iraq and Syria and Libya, slow, patient, perfectly attuned to the land beneath her boots. The saguaros stood like sentinels in the fading light, their arms raised against a sky bleeding copper, and rose. The ground was rocky and sparse, threaded with creosote and brittlebush, and the occasional cholla cactus glowing gold in the last of the sun. She reached the ranch at full dark. The stars were out, dense and brilliant, the way they only get in the desert, far from city light. A sky so alive it seemed to breathe. Ethan would have loved this sky. He would have pointed at Jupiter and named all its moons in order and asked her, in that careful, wondering voice of his, whether she thought there might be life on Europa. And she would have said, "Maybe, baby, maybe," and his eyes would have gone wide behind those 2 big glasses. She observed the property for 90 minutes from a low-rise 200 meters north. 4 men. 2 inside the main house, 1 at a communications table, 1 moving between rooms, 1 in the converted garage, 1 walking a loose perimeter. A circuit around the main house and the outbuilding, 12 minutes, predictable. She timed him, found his patterns, noted where he paused to check his phone, where he stopped to light a cigarette, where he cut corners, where he swung wide. She found the gap. On the south side of the outbuilding, the guard's circuit brought him within 10 feet of the door, and every time he walked past without looking. Whatever was inside the outbuilding was not his concern. His concern was the perimeter. Ethan was in the outbuilding. Helen was certain, dark, isolated from the command element, standard hostage protocol. She had spent 23 years studying how hostages were held. She had recovered people from compounds in Fallujah, apartments in Beirut, cave complexes in the Afghan mountains. She knew the patterns, she knew the logic, and she knew every protocol had a weakness. The weakness here was 4 men spread across 3 structures, operating on a 12-minute rotation, in a landscape that belonged to her. She moved at midnight. The desert was cold now, the Sonoran winter cold that drops fast and deep, heat bleeding out of the earth into a sky so vast the cold seems to come from the stars themselves. 200 meters, nothing. A walk to the mailbox. The guard passed the south side of the outbuilding at 12:07. Helen let him go, counted, moved. Simple padlock on the door. She picked it in under a minute. Inside, darkness, dust, the smell of old hay and motor oil. She stepped through the door and held still, letting her eyes adjust. Ethan was in the corner. He sat on a folding cot, knees pulled to his chest, arms wrapped tight around his legs. His face was pale, his eyes were red, his wrists were bound with zip ties. He was wearing the blue T-shirt with the solar system on it, his favorite, the one from the Science Museum gift shop. He didn't have his glasses. He looked up, saw a shape in the darkness. And before sound could come out of his open mouth, Helen was there, her hand gentle over his lips, her face close to his. "It's Grandma," she whispered. "I'm here. Don't make a sound, baby. Can you do that?" Ethan nodded. His eyes were enormous, seeing the world in blur without his glasses, but seeing her face. The face he knew better than any other face in the world. The relief that moved through him was so complete, so total, that his whole body went limp. Helen cut the zip ties. She pulled him against her chest and held him. 3 seconds of being a grandmother. 3 seconds of feeling his heartbeat against hers, his small hands gripping the front of her jacket, his breath warm at her neck. "Are you hurt?" "No, they didn't hurt me." A shaky exhale. "I was scared, Grandma." "I know, baby. You were brave. I need you to be brave for 5 more minutes. Can you do that?" "Yes." She picked him up. He was small for his age, and she was strong in the way of desert women. Not showy strength, not muscle-deep strength, but the kind of endurance that keeps going long after the body says stop. She carried him to the door, checked the perimeter. The guard was on the far side of the main house. 7 minutes. Enough. She moved, Ethan on her hip, pistol in her right hand, north across the open ground toward the rise. The desert floor was hard and rocky beneath her boots, and she made almost no sound. Stars blazed overhead, dense and silver. The cold was sharp and clean. The only sound was wind through the creosote. They were 100 meters from the ranch when the outbuilding door, closed but not relockable from outside, swung open in the wind and slammed against the frame. The sound cracked across the still desert like a gunshot. Shouts, lights flooding on, the garage bay grinding open, boots on gravel, and the specific urgent chaos of men who have just discovered their hostage is gone. Helen moved faster, not running. Moving, controlled, deliberate, reading the ground by memory and starlight, every wash and ridge already mapped in her bones. Ethan's face was pressed against her shoulder. His arms were locked around her neck. "Close your eyes," she said quietly. "Count the moons of Jupiter for me. Out loud, quietly." "Io," Ethan whispered against her jacket. "Europa, Ganymede, Callisto. Keep going. Amalthea, Himalaya, Ilara." She reached the rise, set him behind a cluster of boulders, and knelt in front of him, face to face. "Stay right here. Don't move. Keep counting." "Grandma." "Count, baby." She turned back toward the ranch. 2 flashlight beams swept the desert south of the outbuilding, toward the road, the logical escape route. They didn't know about the trailhead. They didn't know about the Jeep. They were looking for vehicle tracks because that's what made sense. That's what logic dictated. And they were dealing with a 64-year-old grandmother, so logic should have been enough. But logic had never accounted for the desert ghost. Helen moved parallel to the search line, circling south through the washes where sandy floors swallowed footprints, staying behind ridge lines where the flashlight beams couldn't reach. She approached the ranch from the southeast, the direction they had already searched and dismissed. The first man was the perimeter guard, standing near the outbuilding, speaking into a radio. She came out of the dark behind him and applied a chokehold. He was young and strong, and she was 64, and her arms burned with the effort. But she had done this in sandstorms, in 130-degree heat, in the backs of moving vehicles. She held on until he went still, secured him with the zip ties from his own vest. The second man was in the garage, hunched over the communications equipment. She crossed the distance before he turned around, stripped the rifle from his hands, and put him on the concrete floor, with a technique that used his own momentum against him. He hit hard. She secured him. The third man was near the access road, sweeping his light across the dirt. She moved through the desert to a position behind him, waited for him to turn away. 4 quick steps. And he heard her at the last second and spun. Too late. Heel of palm to the solar plexus. Controlled strike to the side of the neck. He dropped. 3 down, 1 remaining. She entered the main house through the kitchen door. Adobe walls, thick and old, small windows. A layout she had already mapped from 200 meters away. Kitchen to living room to bedroom to the back room that served as the operations center. She found him there. He was standing at a table covered in maps and photographs, and an open laptop displaying a satellite image of her house on Calle Esperanza. Her garden was visible, her Jeep in the driveway, Ethan's bicycle in the yard. He was in his 50s, lean, short gray hair, civilian clothes, but he stood the way military men stand, weight balanced, shoulders set, a pistol on his hip, hands at his sides. He turned when she entered, looked at her, this 64-year-old woman in work boots and a desert jacket, holding a suppressed pistol with the quiet familiarity of someone who had carried one for longer than some people have been alive. "Helen Morrow," he said, "the desert ghost. You know who I am, Helen said, which means you know how this ends. I was agency, too. His voice was measured, almost respectful. 15 years, clandestine service. I know what you are. I studied your operations at the farm. They used your Iraq extraction as a case study. 60 miles across open desert. 0 casualties, 0 trace. He paused. I always wondered if the reports were accurate. They were. Then you know what this is about. The Qadir drive contains identities that certain people would pay a great deal to recover. People still embedded. People whose exposure would... You took my grandson. Helen's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It filled the room the way sand fills an hourglass, grain by grain, quiet, relentless, inevitable. You took him off a sidewalk 2 blocks from his home. You took his glasses off his face. You bound his wrists. He is 10 years old, and he spent hours alone in the dark, wondering if his grandmother was coming. Silence. Here's what happens now, she said. You sit down. You put your hands on that table. You wait for the people I've already called to come and collect you. The hard drive stays with me. It will be destroyed properly by people I trust. A beat. Not by brokers, and not by men who kidnap children for leverage. She watched him calculate, watched him weigh the pistol on his hip against the one in her hand. Weigh 15 years of clandestine service against 23 years of direct action operations in the most hostile terrain on Earth. You're 64, he said finally. I have entered compounds harder to breach than this ranch, Helen said, and left without a single person knowing I was ever there. I walked 60 miles across Iraq with 3 wounded teammates and didn't leave a footprint. You studied my operations at the farm. Then you know that if I decided this conversation should end differently, it would already be over. A long silence. Sit down. He sat down. The FBI arrived at the ranch at 4 a.m. 2 helicopters, 16 agents, full tactical response. They found 4 men secured and restrained across 3 structures, weapons cleared, the operations center intact with evidence laid out on the table as if prepared for inventory. The lead agent, 14 years in the field, noted in her report that the individual responsible for the operation appeared to have conducted it alone, on foot, across 8 miles of open desert, at night, at the age of 64. The former officer was charged with kidnapping, conspiracy, and violations of the Espionage Act. He received 22 years. His 3 hired men received sentences ranging from 8 to 12. The private intelligence firm they had served was identified and dismantled through a joint investigation spanning 3 allied services. The Qadir hard drive was turned over to the CIA under a chain of custody Helen personally supervised. She stood at a secure facility in Virginia and watched it go through an industrial degausser, then a physical shredder, then an incinerator. She stood there until there was nothing left but ash. She picked Ethan up from the FBI field office. He was wrapped in a blanket, holding a cup of hot chocolate with both hands, watching a solar system documentary on a victim advocate's laptop. He was wearing borrowed glasses that didn't quite fit. When Helen walked through the door, he set the hot chocolate down very carefully, the way a 10-year-old does when he is trying very hard to be grown up, and then ran to her and buried his face against her stomach and wrapped his arms around her waist. He didn't say anything for a long time. Helen put her hand on his head. The FBI agents in the room looked at each other and looked away, because there are moments that belong only to the people inside them, and this was one of those moments. "Grandma," Ethan said finally, voice muffled against her jacket. "I counted all the moons, all 79. A small pause. "Actually 95. They found more." Helen smiled. A real smile. The kind that starts somewhere deep and works its way up through everything she had been and everything she had done and everything she had survived, until it reaches the surface and settles like sunlight on desert sand. "Then you'll have to teach me the new ones," she said. They drove home in the Jeep with the windows down. The sun was rising over the Catalina Mountains, painting the sky in copper and gold. The saguaros lined the roadside like old friends. The desert stretched in every direction, vast and patient and eternal, and Helen drove through it with her grandson beside her, and the morning air filling the cab with the smell of creosote and dust, and the particular clean emptiness of a landscape that had been, for as long as she could remember, her home and her weapon and her sanctuary all at once. Ethan fell asleep before they reached Calle Esperanza, head against the window, borrowed glasses sliding down his nose, mouth slightly open, and Helen looked at him the way she had looked at Rachel, and the way she had looked at the desert, and the way she had looked at everything she had ever loved, with the knowledge of exactly what she would do to keep it. She carried him inside, put him in his bed, tucked the covers around him the way she had every night since Rachel died. She moved the telescope to the window and angled it toward the part of the sky where Jupiter would be visible that evening, because when he woke up he would want to look, and the eyepiece should be ready. She went to the kitchen, made coffee, sat at the table, and looked at the garden through the window. The tomato plants needed watering. The peppers were almost ready. Saturday's farmer's market was 3 days away. The pistol was back behind the false panel, the satellite phone beside it, the passports, the cash, the knife, all of it sealed and silent. Helen Croft drank her coffee and watched the morning light move across the garden and listened to her grandson breathe in the next room. The house was quiet. The desert was still. The ghost was home. She had spent 23 years moving through the deserts of the world and leaving no trace, doing things in the dark that kept the light burning for people who would never know the dark existed. She had moved across 60 miles of Iraqi sand without leaving a footprint, and come home without a single headline, without a single medal anyone would ever see, without a single name that the world would ever know. Now she grew tomatoes, made salsa, raised a boy who counted the moons of Jupiter and looked up at the sky with the kind of wonder that makes you believe, even at 64, that the world is still full of things worth protecting. Some people wear capes. Helen Croft wore work boots and a wide-brimmed hat, and she was the most dangerous person in the Sonoran Desert, and nobody knew it. Nobody, that is, except the desert itself, which had always known, which had given her its name, because she had earned it, across 60 miles of Iraqi sand, across 23 years of silence, across every dark and merciless landscape the world had ever asked her to cross. The desert ghost retired, growing tomatoes on a street called Hope. If you believe that real heroes carry scars, not capes, share this story.